April 17th, 1873, midnight, the parish of St. James, Louisiana, where the Mississippi River bends like a serpent through sugar plantations built on bones. In the slave quarters behind the Beaumont estate, a coffin splinters from within. The sound is unholy, wood cracking against flesh that should be cold, against hands that should be still. But Thomas Moreau is not dead, and tonight, beneath a blood-red moon that hangs low like God's own watching eye, he will rise from the pine box they buried him in, and he will make them remember that some debts are paid not in currency, but in screams. They thought they'd killed him, beaten him past the point of breath in the tobacco barn 3 days prior. His crime nothing more than looking Master Beaumont's daughter in the eyes when she spoke. 40 lashes, a shattered jaw, ribs cracked like kindling. The overseers dragged what they believed was his corpse to the edge of the property, nailed him into cheap wood, and buried him shallow in unmarked earth where the forgotten go to rot. But Thomas had learned something in those long hours underground, clawing at wood while dirt filled his lungs. Hatred is a stronger currency than oxygen. This is not a story of survival. This is a testament to what happens when a man is buried alive with nothing but rage to keep his heart beating, and when he digs his way back to the surface, he brings hell with him. The night air tastes like smoke and jasmine when Thomas pulls himself from the ground, caked in mud and blood, his eyes no longer holding the light of submission but the coal-black burn of reckoning. The Beaumont mansion glows warm in the distance, its white columns proud and oblivious, its windows golden with lamplight and laughter. Inside, they drink French wine and discuss cotton futures while the people they own sleep in chains. But Thomas is no longer owned. Death tried to claim him and failed, and now he walks between worlds, a ghost made flesh, an impossible thing with an axe in his hands and 23 years of stolen humanity screaming in his veins. If you're watching this, if this story grips something primal in your chest, then stay, because what happens next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about justice, about vengeance, and about what one man can do when the world buries him alive and he refuses to stay down. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below, because legends like Thomas Moreau don't ask for permission to be remembered. They carve their names into history with blood and fire. Thomas Moreau was born in 1850 on the Beaumont plantation, the son of a woman named Celeste who died bringing him into a world that had already decided he was worth less than the mule in Master Beaumont's stable. His father, a name he never knew, a face erased by the auction block, disappeared when Thomas was 3, sold upriver to pay for the master's gambling debts in New Orleans. He grew up in the shadow of the big house, learning early that survival meant invisibility, that every glance, every word, every breath had to be measured and weighed against the ever-present threat of the whip. By the time he was 10, his back bore the cross-hatched scars of a dozen punishments for crimes he didn't commit. A missing chicken blamed on him, a broken plow he never touched, the mere suspicion that he'd smiled at the wrong moment. The Beaumont estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of Louisiana Delta, a kingdom built on stolen labor and enforced through terror. The main house, a Greek revival monument to wealth extracted from human misery, stood at the center like a white-columned god, surrounded by tobacco fields that stretched to the horizon, punctuated by the gray wooden shacks where 300 enslaved people lived and died in service to a family that considered them livestock. Master Richard Beaumont, a man of 42 with soft hands and hard eyes, inherited the plantation from his father and ran it with the cold efficiency of a man who genuinely believed that black flesh was designed by Providence to enrich white pockets. His wife, Charlotte, was a New Orleans socialite who spent her days in the parlor, embroidering pillowcases and pretending not to hear the screams that sometimes drifted up from the tobacco barn. Their daughter, Josephine, 17 and educated in Paris, had returned home that spring with romantic notions about the pastoral beauty of plantation life, notions that would shatter the moment she looked into Thomas Moreau's eyes and saw not a slave, but a human being staring back at her with quiet, devastating intelligence. The overseers were the true architects of daily terror on the Beaumont estate. Chief among them was Silas Crow, a man whose very existence seemed designed to prove that cruelty was a vocation. Tall and thin as a scarecrow, with pale eyes the color of dirty ice and a perpetual sneer that twisted his thin lips, Crow had been beating black bodies for 20 years, ever since he arrived from Tennessee with nothing but a bullwhip and an appetite for power. He wore the same stained duster coat every day, its pockets heavy with leather straps and brass knuckles, and he moved through the plantation like death on horseback, always watching, always waiting for the smallest infraction to justify the violence he craved. Beneath him were three more overseers: Dutch McCarty, a former soldier who'd learned his brutality in the Mexican-American War and applied those lessons to unarmed men and women with mechanical precision; Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a Creole who beat his own people with particular viciousness to prove his loyalty to whiteness; and young Connor Whitfield, barely 20 years old, who approached each whipping with the enthusiasm of a man trying to impress his elders, each strike of the lash a desperate plea for acceptance into the fraternity of monsters. Together, they maintained order through a carefully calibrated system of punishment: 15 lashes for talking back, 25 for breaking a tool, 40 for looking a white person directly in the eyes. The tobacco barn, a cavernous structure at the eastern edge of the property, served as their cathedral of pain, a place where screams echoed off wooden beams and blood soaked into the dirt floor until the earth itself seemed cursed. It was in this barn, on April 14, 1873, that Thomas Moreau was beaten so severely that even the overseers believed they'd killed him. The incident that sentenced Thomas to his shallow grave began with a single glance, a moment so small, so human, that its consequences reveal the absolute insanity of the system that governed plantation life. Josephine Beaumont had been walking through the main courtyard, her white dress bright in the April sun, carrying a basket of cut flowers from the garden. She'd asked Thomas, who was repairing a wagon wheel nearby, if he thought the azaleas would look better in the dining room or the parlor. It was an innocent question, perhaps even a kind one, spoken by a girl who'd spent 3 years in Paris and returned with vague abolitionist sympathies she didn't quite have the courage to act on. Thomas, 23 years old and exhausted from 14 hours of labor, had made a fatal error. He'd looked up. He'd met her eyes. And for 3 seconds, 3 eternal damning seconds, he'd treated her question as if it came from an equal, as if the words of an enslaved man about flower arrangements mattered in a universe that had spent every moment of his existence telling him they didn't. He'd said, "The dining room, Miss Josephine. The light there in the evening would make them glow." It was a thoughtful answer, an intelligent answer, an answer that revealed the mind behind the skin, and that was the unforgivable sin. Silas Crow had been watching from the porch of the overseer's house, and what he saw in that brief exchange terrified him in a way he couldn't articulate. He saw a white girl and a black man existing, for just a moment, in a space where the vast machinery of racial hierarchy didn't apply. He saw humanity meeting humanity, and so, within the hour, Thomas was dragged to the tobacco barn, accused of insolence and impudence, and subjected to a beating that lasted until the sun set and his blood formed puddles in the dust. They used 3 different whips on Thomas that day. Crow started with the standard cowhide lash, 10 feet long and braided with practiced cruelty, each strike designed to maximize pain without causing immediate death, because a dead slave was worthless, but a terrified one was an investment in social control. Dutch McCarty took over when Crow's arm grew tired, switching to a shorter whip embedded with small pieces of metal that tore chunks of flesh with each impact. By the time young Connor Whitfield finished with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a weapon designed specifically to shred skin and muscle, Thomas had stopped screaming. He hung from the barn's support beam by rope around his wrists, his body a canvas of lacerated meat, his breathing shallow and wet with the sound of punctured lungs. When they cut him down, he collapsed like a puppet with severed strings, and Crow pressed 2 fingers to Thomas's neck, felt for a pulse, felt nothing, and declared him dead with the same casual indifference a man might note a change in the weather. They didn't inform Master Beaumont immediately. He was entertaining guests from Baton Rouge, and the death of property was a matter to be reported after dessert. Instead, they wrapped Thomas's body in a stained canvas tarp, loaded him onto a cart, and hauled him to the far edge of the plantation where a cluster of unmarked graves held the bodies of enslaved people who'd died from disease, exhaustion, or violence over the past 40 years. Jean-Baptiste hammered together a rough pine coffin while Connor dug a hole barely 4 feet deep. They dumped Thomas inside, nailed the lid shut with 6 long spikes, and covered the coffin with earth as the sun set on April 14, 1873. But Silas Crow had made a critical mistake. He'd been so eager to declare Thomas dead that he hadn't waited long enough, hadn't checked carefully enough. Thomas's heart was still beating, slowly, faintly, but beating nonetheless. What happens to a man when he wakes in absolute darkness? When his first conscious breath fills his lungs with soil, when his hands press against wood inches from his face and his mind understands with perfect, crystalline horror that he has been buried alive? Thomas's return to consciousness was not a gentle thing. It was violent, primal, his body convulsing in the confined space, his shattered ribs screaming with each movement, his jaw swollen shut so that he couldn't even scream. Panic came first. The animal terror of suffocation, of being trapped in a space so small it might as well be a second skin. He thrashed against the coffin lid, his torn back pressing against rough wood, fresh blood mixing with old. Dirt sifted through the gaps between boards, filling his nose, his mouth. For the first hour, or what felt like an hour in that timeless void, Thomas fought with the blind desperation of any creature that wants to live. But then something shifted. The panic burned itself out, leaving behind something colder, something that glowed in the darkness of his mind like an ember in a forge. He stopped thrashing. He stopped trying to scream. Instead, he pressed his palms flat against the coffin lid and thought about Silas Crow's face. He thought about Dutch McCarty's laugh. He thought about young Connor's eager brutality and Jean-Baptiste's betrayal of his own blood. He thought about Master Beaumont sipping bourbon while men died in his tobacco barn. And in that thinking, in that long meditation on injustice, Thomas found something the overseers could never have anticipated. He found purpose. The human body can survive approximately 3 days without water, less if actively injured and losing blood. But hatred, Thomas discovered, was its own form of sustenance. Rage could keep a heart beating when hope had long since expired. For 3 days and 3 nights, Thomas existed in that coffin, drifting in and out of consciousness, his mind fracturing and reforming around a single crystalline thought: vengeance. He had no water, no food, no light, nothing but the weight of earth above him and the fire in his chest. His fingers, despite their broken nails and torn flesh, began to work at the coffin lid. The overseers had been lazy in their burial, and the 6 nails holding the top in place were driven in at careless angles. Thomas had nothing to work with but his own body. So he used it. He pressed his thumbs against the nail heads, ignored the pain as wood splinters drove into his flesh, and pushed with the desperate strength of a man who understood that dying here, in this box, would mean his murder went unavenged. It took him 2 full days to work the first nail loose. 2 days of constant pressure, of blood and sweat making his hands slick, of whispered prayers to a God he wasn't sure was listening. When the nail finally gave way with a soft creak, Thomas felt something like joy, a savage satisfaction that kept him conscious through the agony. The second nail came easier. The third took another day. By the time he pried the 4th nail free, he could feel fresh air seeping through the gap, could smell the earth and night-blooming jasmine and the distant smoke of the plantation's cook fires. On the night of April 17th, with the blood moon rising over Louisiana, Thomas Moreau pressed both hands against the loosened coffin lid and pushed with every molecule of strength his ravaged body possessed. The wood gave way. Dirt cascaded down, filling the coffin, but Thomas was already moving, already clawing upward through the loose soil, his fingers breaking through the surface like a swimmer breaching water after too long underwater. He emerged from the earth like something prehistoric, like a creature from a time before mercy or law, a man caked in mud and blood and his own filth, his eyes white in the darkness, his breathing ragged and desperate. For a long moment, Thomas simply lay on the ground beside his open grave, staring up at the red moon and understanding that he had died and been reborn as something new. The man who'd been beaten in the tobacco barn was gone. That man had believed, somewhere deep in his soul, that if he was obedient enough, careful enough, invisible enough, he might survive to old age. That man had held on to the thin, desperate hope that the world might someday recognize his humanity. But 3 days in the earth had burned away such illusions. Thomas Moreau, version 2, knew exactly what he was. A ghost, a revenant, a walking impossibility. And ghosts, he understood, were not bound by the rules that governed the living. He rose to his feet slowly, testing his body, cataloging the damage. His ribs were definitely broken, each breath a knife in his side. His jaw was fractured but functional. His back was a mass of torn flesh held together by dried blood and rage. He should be dead. By every law of medicine and physics, he should be a corpse rotting in that pine box. But he wasn't. He was standing. He was walking. And 20 yards away, leaning against the side of the tool shed, he could see an axe, its blade catching moonlight like a promise. Thomas limped toward it, each step an act of will, each movement a declaration of intent. When his fingers closed around the worn wooden handle, he felt complete for the first time in his life. The axe was simple, honest, a tool designed to split wood, to cut and cleave and separate. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. The Beaumont plantation at midnight was a study in contrasts, the big house glowing with warm lamplight and the laughter of white voices floating through open windows, while the slave quarters sat in enforced darkness and fearful silence. Thomas moved through this landscape like a shadow, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth paths, his body low and instinctive despite the pain that screamed through every nerve. He knew this property with the intimate knowledge of someone who'd spent 23 years studying every inch of his prison. He knew which floorboards on the overseer's porch creaked and which stayed silent. He knew where the dogs were chained and how far their leads reached. He knew that Silas Crow's house, a small cottage on the eastern edge of the property, had a window that never quite closed properly, a gap just wide enough for a man to slip his fingers through and lift the latch. Thomas had repaired that window 6 months ago, and Crow had never bothered to check his work. Now, standing in the darkness outside that cottage, axe in hand, Thomas whispered a prayer that wasn't a prayer, more like a conversation with whatever dark god watches over the wronged and the buried. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said to the night air, to the red moon, to the ghost of his mother who'd died screaming. "I'm asking for strength. I'm asking for enough breath to finish this." The window slid open without sound. Thomas pulled himself through, his broken ribs protesting, and dropped into Silas Crow's bedroom. The overseer was asleep, snoring softly, his leather coat hanging on a peg by the door, his bullwhip coiled on the nightstand like a faithful pet. Thomas stood there for a moment, studying the man who'd beaten him to death, or tried to. In sleep, Crow looked almost human, almost vulnerable. But Thomas had learned in that coffin that vulnerability was a luxury reserved for those who'd never buried an innocent man alive. Thomas raised the axe slowly, feeling its weight, understanding that this moment was the pivot point of his entire existence, that everything he'd been and everything he would become balanced on the decision he was about to make. In a just world, there would be trials and juries and laws that applied equally to all men regardless of skin color. In a just world, Thomas could walk to the sheriff's office, tell his story, and watch Silas Crow hang for attempted murder. But this was not a just world. This was Louisiana in 1873, where the war had ended but its hatreds persisted, where black testimony wasn't worth the air it took to speak it, where a white overseer could beat a black man to death and face no consequences beyond the mild inconvenience of filing paperwork about damaged property. Thomas understood this with perfect clarity. He understood that the law would never defend him, that justice would never arrive, that if he wanted accountability for the crime committed against him, he would have to become the judge, the jury, and the executioner. So he stopped waiting for the world to recognize his humanity, stopped hoping for a mercy that would never come. Instead, he tightened his grip on the axe handle and brought it down with all the force his broken body could summon. The blade caught Silas Crow in the center of the chest, splitting sternum and rib cage, driving deep into the heart that had beat through 20 years of casual atrocity. Crow's eyes snapped open, not with pain at first, but with absolute incomprehension, with the shocked recognition that the natural order he'd spent his life enforcing had just inverted. He tried to speak, tried to scream, but blood filled his throat. Thomas leaned close enough that Crow could see his face in the moonlight streaming through the window, close enough that the overseer's dying brain could process the impossible. The slave he'd buried 3 days ago was standing over him, very much alive and very much armed. "You thought you killed me," Thomas whispered. "But some debts survive death." Silas Crow died with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if searching for an answer to a question he'd never thought to ask. Thomas pulled the axe free, the blade making a wet sound as it separated from bone and flesh, and stood in the darkness of the cottage, breathing hard, listening to the silence that followed violence. There was no satisfaction in the killing, not the kind the overseers seemed to find in their work. No pleasure or power rush. Instead, Thomas felt only a grim sense of completion, like a man who'd paid the first installment on an enormous debt. But the ledger was far from balanced. One overseer dead meant 3 more breathing. Meant Master Beaumont still sleeping peacefully in his 4-poster bed. Meant a system of cruelty still grinding forward, as if Thomas Moreau had never clawed his way out of the earth. He moved to Crow's closet and found what he needed. A clean shirt, pants that almost fit, boots 2 sizes too large but serviceable. He dressed slowly, methodically, transforming himself from a blood-caked ghost into something that could move through the plantation without immediately drawing attention. In Crow's desk drawer, he found a ring of keys. Master keys that opened every building on the property, including the tobacco barn, the tool sheds, and most importantly, the locked storage room beneath the main house where Master Beaumont kept his collection of firearms. Thomas pocketed the keys and stood for a moment in the doorway of the cottage, looking back at Crow's corpse sprawled across blood-soaked sheets. "That's one," he said to the dead man. "But I'm just getting started." The night was still young, the moon still red, and somewhere in the slave quarters, 300 people slept in chains, unaware that one of their own had returned from death itself and was about to burn down the entire architecture of their oppression. Thomas stepped out into the night air, axe in one hand, keys in the other, and began walking toward the overseer's barracks where Dutch McCarty, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, and young Connor Whitfield slept in adjacent rooms, dreaming whatever dreams men who beat other men for a living are capable of dreaming. The overseer's barracks sat 100 yards from the main house, a long wooden structure divided into 4 separate quarters, each with its own entrance. Thomas approached from the rear, moving through the vegetable garden where enslaved women grew the food that fed the white family, while their own children went hungry. His boots, Crow's boots, left tracks in the soft earth, but he wasn't concerned with covering his trail anymore. By the time anyone found these tracks, by the time the sun rose and the plantation woke to discover what had happened in the dark hours, Thomas intended to be either dead or so far gone that tracking would be meaningless. He tried the first door, locked. The second opened with a soft creak, revealing Dutch McCarty's room, spare and military neat. His former soldier's discipline evident in the way his boots stood at perfect attention beside the bed, and his coat hung on a peg with geometric precision. McCarty slept on his back, his hands folded across his chest like a man already laid out for burial. And perhaps that was prophetic, because Thomas moved across the room in 3 silent steps and drove the axe blade through McCarty's throat before the man could transition from sleep to waking. Blood sprayed across the white pillowcase in a pattern like dark flowers, and McCarty's hands came up reflexively, clutching at the wound, his eyes wide with the terrible understanding that he was dying and could do nothing to prevent it. Thomas didn't speak this time. There was nothing to say to a man who'd whipped pregnant women and laughed while doing it. Nothing that would bridge the gulf between their humanities. He simply pulled the axe free and moved to the next room where Jean-Baptiste Rousseau lay sleeping, unaware that death was 3 feet away and closing fast. The Creole overseer had betrayed his own people for a position of minor power, had convinced himself that beating black flesh somehow elevated him closer to whiteness, had spent years proving his loyalty through escalating cruelty. Thomas remembered the day Jean-Baptiste had whipped a 12-year-old boy for stealing an apple. Remembered the particular viciousness in those strikes, the way Jean-Baptiste had shouted in French that he was doing this for the boy's own good, teaching him discipline and respect. That boy had been Thomas's cousin. His name had been Marcus, and he'd died 2 years later from an infection that started in the scars Jean-Baptiste had given him. Pause here, in this moment between breaths, between the fall of the axe and the dawn that's coming. What you're witnessing isn't just a story. It's a reckoning that echoes across centuries, a testament to what happens when a system built on cruelty finally meets the man it couldn't kill. Thomas Moreau's vengeance is more than personal. It's ancestral, carrying the weight of every soul buried in unmarked graves, every scream absorbed by tobacco barn walls, every dream deferred and life stolen. If this tale grips something ancient in your chest, if you feel the pulse of righteous fury in your veins, then don't let it end here in silence. Subscribe to witness how legends are born from injustice. Drop a comment below with the names of those history tried to bury. Share this story because some truths refuse to stay underground. They claw their way back to the surface, demanding to be heard, insisting that we remember. Thomas walks through this night so that his name, and all the names like his, burn eternal in collective memory. Now watch what happens when a dead man refuses to stay dead. Retry Jean-Baptiste Rousseau woke to the axe already descending. His last conscious thought a confused recognition of Thomas Moreau's face, a face that should be rotting in the ground, not standing over him with murder blazing in its eyes. The blade split his skull from crown to jaw, ending him so quickly there was no time for prayer or regret, no final moment of understanding. Just darkness rushing in like a flood. Thomas didn't linger. He moved to the fourth room where young Connor Whitfield slept, and here he paused, looking down at the boy because that's what Connor was, really. Just 20 years old and stupid with the invincibility of youth and whiteness. Connor had been eager in his cruelty, yes, but he'd also been taught it, raised in a culture that told him black pain was entertainment and white violence was virtue. For a moment, Thomas considered mercy. Then he remembered the enthusiasm in Connor's face when he'd wielded that cat-o'-nine-tails, remembered the boy laughing as Thomas's flesh peeled away in strips, and mercy died unborn. The axe fell. 3 overseers dead in their beds, their blood soaking into Louisiana soil. Thomas stood in the corridor between their rooms, breathing hard, his broken ribs screaming, and realized he was crying, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what he'd become. He'd spent 23 years trying to survive by being invisible, by swallowing his humanity and pretending he was what they said he was. Now, in the space of an hour, he'd murdered 3 men and felt nothing but a terrible, hollow satisfaction. The main house stood before him like a temple to stolen wealth, its white columns gleaming under the blood moon, its windows still glowing with lamplight even at this late hour. Master Beaumont was awake. Thomas could see his silhouette moving behind the second-floor study window, probably reviewing ledgers, calculating profit margins extracted from human misery. Thomas used Crow's keys to unlock the cellar door and descended into the storage room where Beaumont kept his arsenal. Hunting rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition, and, most importantly, 3 large barrels of lamp oil meant for the winter months. Thomas worked quickly, efficiently, his hands steady despite the trembling in his limbs. He dragged the barrels upstairs, one at a time, ignoring the agony in his back and ribs, and poured oil across the ground floor, soaking the imported carpets, the mahogany furniture, the silk curtains that cost more than a human life. He poured oil on the grand staircase and splashed it against the walls hung with paintings of Beaumont ancestors, men and women who'd built their dynasty on the breaking of black bodies. When the barrels were empty, Thomas stood in the foyer, struck a match from Beaumont's own silver matchbox, and watched the flame dance for a moment before dropping it onto the oil-soaked floor. Fire blossomed instantly, hungrily, racing along the trails of accelerant, climbing walls and consuming everything it touched. The house groaned as flames found the support beams, and somewhere upstairs, Charlotte Beaumont began screaming. Master Richard Beaumont appeared at the top of the burning staircase in his nightshirt, his face twisted with confusion and terror, and finally saw Thomas standing in the foyer below, axe in hand, backlit by flames. "You," Beaumont whispered, and in that single word was the recognition of impossible things, the understanding that the natural order he'd spent his life enforcing had shattered. "You're supposed to be dead." Thomas smiled then, a terrible expression that held no joy, only the cold satisfaction of a debt about to be paid in full. "I was dead," he said, his voice carrying over the roar of flames. "You killed me, but I came back, Master Beaumont. I crawled out of the ground because some things refuse to stay buried. Things like injustice, like rage, like the truth about what you are." Beaumont stumbled down the stairs, his expensive nightshirt catching fire, and Thomas met him halfway with the axe. But this time, he didn't aim for a quick death. This time, he struck Beaumont's legs, crippling him, sending him tumbling down the remaining steps to land in a heap at Thomas's feet. The master of Beaumont Plantation, the man who'd owned 300 human beings, lay helpless in his burning house while the slave he'd murdered stood over him. "Please," Beaumont begged, the word foreign in his mouth, a thing he'd never had to say before. Thomas knelt down, bringing his face close to Beaumont's. "Did they beg?" he asked softly. "All those people you beat and sold and worked to death, did they beg? Did you listen?" He didn't wait for an answer. He simply stood and walked out of the burning house, leaving Richard Beaumont to be consumed by flames he'd spent a lifetime building. By the time Thomas reached the slave quarters, the fire had engulfed the entire main house, flames reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers, smoke billowing in great black clouds that blotted out the red moon. People were emerging from their cabins, men, women, children, all staring at the impossible sight of the big house burning, all frozen between terror and something that might have been hope. They saw Thomas approaching, covered in blood and ash, carrying an axe that dripped red in the firelight, and they knew. Somehow they knew. An old woman named Ruth, who'd been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember, stepped forward and touched Thomas's face with her wrinkled hand. "Child," she whispered, "what have you done?" Thomas looked at her. At all of them, 300 faces watching him with expressions that ranged from awe to horror to desperate, fragile joy. "I died," he said simply. "And then I came back. The overseers are dead. Master Beaumont is dead. The house is burning. At dawn, when they find the bodies, they'll come looking for whoever did this. They'll come with dogs and guns and ropes, and they won't care who they hang as long as someone pays." He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Run, all of you, north, south, wherever you can. Just run. This plantation is finished. Take what you can carry and disappear into the night. Some of you will make it. Some won't, but at least you'll die free." They scattered like seeds on the wind, families grabbing what few possessions they owned, moving into the darkness while the fire raged behind them. Thomas Moreau didn't run. He stood in the center of the burning plantation, watching the flames consume everything, and waited for the dawn. When the sun finally rose on April 18, 1873, it revealed a landscape transformed. The main house reduced to a smoking ruin, the overseer's barracks stained with blood, the slave quarters empty and silent. The neighboring plantation owners arrived by mid-morning with sheriffs and dogs, and they found Thomas sitting on the steps of the burned house, the axe across his knees, waiting. They hanged him before noon in the remains of the tobacco barn where he'd been beaten 3 days earlier. And as the rope tightened around his neck, Thomas looked out at the crowd of white faces come to witness his execution and smiled, because he'd done what he came back from the dead to do. He'd taken his revenge. He'd freed 300 people. He'd proven that even the most carefully constructed system of oppression could be shattered by one man who refused to stay buried. They say that on certain nights, when the moon runs red, over Louisiana you can still see him, Thomas Moreau, the slave who rose from his coffin and burned down his master's world. They say his ghost walks the old Beaumont property, now overgrown and forgotten, carrying an axe and singing songs in a language older than America, songs about justice and fire and the unquenchable thirst for freedom. The historians will tell you he was a murderer, a criminal, a cautionary tale about the dangers of rebellion. But the people who remember, the descendants of those 300 souls who scattered into the night and survived, they call him something else. They call him ancestor. They call him hero. They call him the man who proved that some debts can only be paid in blood, and that no grave is deep enough to bury the truth forever.